Happy birthday, United States of America. It's the 4th of July, 2021. I am now 91 years old, but for this program we need to go back to when I was 18. During that summer, I had been growing corn and watermelon and making hay at home, Skyland Farm in Douglas County, Georgia. Congress, meanwhile, was busy making laws in Washington, D.C. And on June 24, 1948, they declared that, quote, all male citizens and all male resident aliens born between October 1, 1922 and September 18, 1930, end of quote, were required by law to register for the draft and appear at their nearest Selective Service Board between August 1st and September 30th, 1948. Now, back in those days, there were no computers and no television to keep us up to date, and I returned to Berea College on the campus for my sophomore year in early September 1948, unaware of what was going on in Washington. The college, however, was aware and had made arrangements to transport those of us students 18 and over to Richmond, Kentucky, the county seat of Madison County, to register for the draft on September 17th. Now, I don't recall much about the registration except that we were weighed naked and that there was one question on the form which puzzled me. It said something about requesting a special form. I do recall reasoning that I wanted to be treated like everybody else, not special. So I filled in no. I didn't realize that my answer had enormous lifetime implications. In order to write this story, I looked up the form on my computer and found that the passage actually read, by reason of religious training and belief, I am conscientiously opposed to participation in war in any form, and for this reason request that the local board furnish me with a special form for conscientious objectors, SSS Form 150, which I am to complete and return to the local board for its consideration. Under what circumstances, if any, do you believe in the use of force? Describe the actions and behavior in your life in which, in your opinion, most conspicuously demonstrate the consistency and depth of your religious conviction. Now, there was no time while registering to sort out such adult matters, nor, if I had understood it, to decide on the spot what I felt about being trained to wage war. I knew about conscientious objection to war, but had not thought about it in a personal way. Howard Alexander, a close friend of my parents, had been a CO during World War II and spent time being used to test various medical procedures in lieu of serving in the armed forces. For myself, such adult decisions seemed a long way off. First, I needed to get a college degree. The country was not at war. I was a college sophomore focused on classes, student labor, and campus life. And deciding on weighty matters of war or peace were held at arm's length. In May 1949, just before the end of the sophomore year, I received a classification questionnaire. Section 11 asked about my status as a student. I responded, quote, I am in college studying for a Georgia teacher's certificate in agriculture. A week later, May 31st, a 1A classification was mailed back to me. By this time, I had every reason to believe that I would not be called up until I graduated. Selective Service regulations stipulated postponements to students legitimately enrolled in school. I assumed that the government knew what it was doing. So I went on with my life, but during my junior year I did begin attending meetings of the Fellowship of Reconciliation on the Berea campus, and I volunteered to help Roscoe Giffen, a sociology professor, administer a door-to-door poll of citizens of Berea concerning the issue of universal military training. I had also been attending the Methodist church in town and had talked with Dr. Ira J. Martin III, the Methodist student advisor, about nonviolence. I also found Reverend Leon Sandy Sanborn to be very helpful as I tried to sort out my thinking in regards to military solutions and other options for what responsibilities Americans had internationally. Sandy was the pastor of Union Church, an anti-sectarian church on the Berea campus, founded by John G. Fee, the abolitionist preacher, who also founded Berea College. Sandy was a pacifist. He knew my family well from our Ohio days and had officiated at my sister's wedding. I spent the summer of 1950 as a camp counselor at Camp Waco, a YMCA camp in Georgia, and then in September again went on up to Kentucky for my senior year. On September 20th, the draft board mailed me an order to report for Armed Forces Physical Examination, Form 223. The order required me to be in Douglasville, Georgia, at 8:00 a.m. on the 27th of September, 1950. I immediately went to the college dean of men, Kenneth Thompson, for advice, and we mailed an application to change the physical examination to Richmond, Kentucky. Dean Thompson also sent the draft board the following letter with an eye to selective service regulations. Quote, "This is to certify that Mr. John Martin Ramsay is classified as a senior fourth year in Berea College. He has completed more than one academic year of full-time course of instruction in college. He has a point standing of 1.821. The median of the class is 1.649. This places him in the upper half of his class. His rank is 78 in the class of 227. He paid his deposit and made a tentative registration program in May 1950, thus prior to August 1st, 1950, and he planned to attend Berea College for the school year 1950 to 51. The draft board approved the transfer, and I went to Lexington on October 16th for the pre-induction physical. I assumed that I took the bus from Berea to Lexington since Berea College students were not permitted to own or have access to cars. I was just beginning to learn how selective service would make interruptions in my life. A few days later, on October 23rd, 1950, I was mailed a certificate of acceptability stating that I was, quote, found acceptable for induction into the armed services, end quote. I simply continued on with my life, still expecting not to face induction until after graduation. 2 months later, on January 8th, Mother, just back from Christmas travels, found in the pile of accumulated mail a notice for me to report for induction on that day. She immediately called me. Now, I don't recall how she got a hold of me since phones were scarce on the campus back in those days. I went right to Dean Thompson, although it was already 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and he tried to call the local board number 49 in Douglasville, Georgia, my local draft board, and failing to get through, sent the board a telegram requesting a postponement of induction until June 4th. The next day he sent a letter in which he pointed out that provision was made in the Selective Service Act, quote, that a registrant may be denied a deferment, but that he may not be denied a postponement. On January 12th, the board mailed a notice of a 1AP classification. I was able to complete that school year. But I did not graduate since I still had practice teaching and an education course to fulfill. Unfortunately, Dean Thompson had not noticed this when he had written to the draft board. I went ahead and registered with the college for the 1951 fall term, my final term. My brother Bill, who had followed me to Berea College, was now a junior. He and I took the Selective Service College qualifying test together on May 26, 1951. I scored 76, which qualified me for deferment. That summer, I worked as a wiper, the lowest rank in the engine room on the USS Newmarket, a tanker carrying petroleum products for Texaco. I loved the sea. My fellow sailors were friendly, if a bit salty. I got on well enough with them, but found their lifestyle quite dismal and degrading. In port, I didn't follow them to the red light districts. Instead, I went to the post office, sent my money orders to the bank for the next year's college expenses, and sometimes I was able to visit family friends in town, if there were any. The other sailors were concerned that I didn't carry a knife when leaving ship and couldn't understand why I was less afraid of being mugged than they were. My pacifism was beginning to show. It was really quite an enjoyable summer, seeing new places, getting acquainted with a different level of society, earning good wages. The work was dirty, chipping rusty bulkheads, painting them afresh, and putting threads on large steam pipes. There was plenty of time on board to build a model airplane, write letters, read some, watch the porpoises racing at the ship's prow. Late in the summer, we took a load of gasoline from Houston, Texas, to San Francisco by way of the Panama Canal. At that point, I had earned the limit to be able to be claimed as a dependent on my parents' income tax. So I left ship in San Francisco and took a 4-day bus journey across the country home to Georgia. On August 20th, the draft board again classified me 1A, and a week later advised me by mail to prepare for induction. I asked for postponement until I finished school and requested a hearing to plead my case. I then went on to Kentucky and had begun my practice teaching under supervision from the University of Kentucky, when notice came that a hearing was set for 8:30 Friday morning on September 21st. College students were still being given an exemption from the draft as long as they were full-time students in good standing. My main goal at that time was to finish college. That I was singled out to leave school was somewhat distracting, but I fully trusted the deferment to come through. I made the trip back to Georgia to meet with the draft board. Only the chairman showed up. I talked with him for an hour or so, explaining that I had only 17 weeks of school left and was mostly concerned that I might not be in a position to finish my college work if I didn't get my degree now. I asked for a hearing before the entire board, and the chairman told me that he would call another meeting. So I stayed home that weekend, but I heard nothing from the draft board. By mail, which was mailed the same day of my meeting with the chairman, I was informed that the full board had met in the afternoon of September 21st and that my classification remained 1A. As soon as I received that notice, I wrote asking for an appeal to the State Selective Service Board. On September 26th, the board had also mailed me an order to report for induction in Douglasville on the 8th of October. That order and my appeal request had crossed in the mail. The state board, responding to a query from the local board when they received my request, informed the local board that, quote, the registrant is within his rights and should be allowed to appeal. I was not required to report for induction while the appeal was being processed. The appeal board quickly granted me a 2S classification until the 1st of February. Thus far, the only issue between me and the draft board was the matter of postponing induction until after graduation. I had said nothing to the draft board about my conscientious objection to war. I can only imagine what a stir it would have made within the board if I had told them of my concern about military service. It would have precipitated a confrontation much earlier, and I was not prepared for a confrontation. I certainly would not have been allowed to graduate, nor obtain a teaching certificate. Perhaps I had taken the easy way out, but I'm sure that I would also have been personally unprepared to effectively argue my case for a 1-0 classification. I think I knew in my heart that I could never use weapons to solve the world's problems, but I kept putting off that acknowledgement because of the consequences. I still had to convince myself that I would rather die myself than take another's life. It would have been foolhardy to request conscientious objector status before I was quite clear about that. After spending Christmas with my family at Patty and Earl's house in Columbus on New Year's Eve, 1951, I made a resolution to notify the draft board and request Form 150. I knew the consequences and was finally ready to meet them. I did not know that the ordeal would last 5 more years. It took me until February 1st, the last day of my student deferment, to compose the letter stating that I was a conscientious objector and to get up the courage to actually send it off to the draft board. I acknowledged in that letter that the board, quote, may be distressed at this news, but I have been in distress for the last 4 years thinking about going to war, end quote. A week later, I notified the board that I had been accepted at Hartford Seminary Foundation to take a course in the School of Missions and had applied for a position in Asia with the Methodist Board of Missions. During my first 3 years of college, the issue of military training had been more of an intellectual debate for me than an immediate decision which I had to make. However, when the United States entered the Korean War in 1950 and graduation neared, the matter began to weigh on me more and more. My last semester on Berea campus saw many late-night discussions about human nature, violence and nonviolence, various types of solutions to conflicts, and the impending choice of serving our country as a soldier in Korea or finding other ways to serve. My deepest and most meaningful discussions were with my classmate, Charles Morris Wesley. Now, Morris was drafted the summer after graduation in the spring of 1951. I felt that he was one of the few soldiers who went to that war having looked squarely at the issues and finally deciding that it was his duty to defend a free world from communists by military means. Most men, I was sure, went without asking any questions simply because serving in the army was what one did. They certainly were courageous too, but in a different way. Morris served in the infantry, and he saw firsthand the reality of war. We never discussed his experiences after the war, but have remained fast friends. In fact, I asked him to be best man when I got married in 1954, and I took him back to Korea as a member of the alumni dance troupe in 1984 in Seoul, as we Americans passed by on parade with the other performing troops from around the world participating in the Orient's first Siaf Folk Festival. I felt that the enthusiastic applause given to our American troupe was meant for Morris. The South Koreans appreciated what Americans had done. I took a different route. I felt that many international conflicts arise from the end result of greed, repression, and disparities between rich and poor. An agriculturalist might be able to provide some remedies to hunger and poverty. I was aware that plowshares take time to put to use, whereas swords can be put to immediate use. But I decided to give my life to the long view in order to deflect future crises before they became so intractable that they led to war. Form 150 requested me to, quote, describe the nature of your belief and state whether or not your belief in a supreme being involves duties which to you are superior to those arising from any human relation. End quote. I was then, and at age 91 now, sure that my allegiance to God comes first for me. The commandments are, thou shalt not kill, do good to those who hate you, lay down your life for others. The Kennedy School of Missions classes at Hartford Seminary Foundation in Hartford, Connecticut, would prepare me to become an agricultural missionary under the Methodist Church. George Strong, assistant pastor at Union Church in Berea, had helped make arrangements with Hartford Seminary and put me in touch with Sam Birchie, a faculty member. Sam met me at the train station in Hartford and took me to his apartment for the first night. He had arranged a small party with 2 other returning male students. Wine was served. I declined, but the other guys soon progressed through the entire bottle. Perhaps they had brought it as a gift for our host. In the middle of the night, both guys got sick. The odor of wine in puke and my previous experiences aboard the USS Newmarket, my summer job in 1951, reinforced my resolve, a legacy passed on by my parents, not to drink alcoholic beverages. Arrangements were made for me to stay in the home of Dr. and Mrs. Henry Allen Gleason, Jr., my linguistics professor. The Gleasons had 2 young children, a boy and a girl, and they treated me like a family member. I may have helped with some of the housework, but am truly indebted to them for their hospitality. I took classes in linguistics, how to stay healthy in hot climates, and Indian culture. I learned the Indian national anthem, how to hear and duplicate sounds from other languages, and that syrup of ipecac was indispensable in a missionary's first aid kit. I took a physical exam as part of the application procedure for service overseas under the Methodist Board of Missions. I wanted to go to Africa, where the needs seemed greatest and improved agriculture to be one of the solutions. I also filled out Form 150, and it was received by the draft board on February 15, 1952. A copy of it is in my draft file. I worked as a busboy at Hartford Seminary dining room to partially earn my way. The dining room was an elegant hall. French cuisine was served by Frank, a creative chef. There were 2 memorable meals. 2 Greek Orthodox priests were visiting the campus. Greek Orthodox priests do not cut their hair, ever. These guys had long gray beards and mustaches. In order to eat the soup served as the first course, they had to part the hair attached to their upper lip before they could insert the spoon. I was fascinated and curious about how grooming and cutting of hair developed during the process of cultural evolution, but I was glad to be clean-shaven. The other memorable meal was for graduation at the end of the term. Frank prepared lobster au Newburg. It reeked of wine. Several students got sick afterwards, so my otherwise productive experience at Hartford was squeezed between 2 wines. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This is a chapter about my selective service ordeal and not about the rest of my life, which, as attested to by my photographs, I continued to pursue with determination. I was not willing to put my life on hold while Selective Service deliberated my fate. The board classified me 1A on February 20th, 1952, and received on March 3rd, 1952, my request for a personal appearance to explain my position in asking for the status as a conscientious objector. I was then advised to appear before the board on March 17th. In the meantime, I asked various church and school officials and personal friends to write letters to the draft board. I asked my friends to write concerning my desire to serve my country in non-military ways. The draft board received letters from Reverend Steinburn, pastor at Union Church, Emma Williams, Jr., Secretary of the Missionary Personnel for the Board of Missions and Church Extension of the Methodist Church, Witherspoon Dodge, Waldo Rasnack, Herman Will, Jr., on the Commission on World Peace of the Methodist Church, Reverend Floyd F. Worley, pastor of the First Methodist Church in Hartford, Henry Gleason, Jr., Secretary of the Kennedy School of Missions faculty, Reverend Hubert Reynolds, Chairman of the Hartford Fellowship of Reconciliation, and E.J. Weeks, acting head of the Department of English at Berea College and my former dorm parent. I took a train from Connecticut to Georgia for the hearing, and then immediately returned back to Hartford to continue my studies. The expense of the trip was beyond my budget, and my parents helped me out. The members of the draft board in Douglasville were decent men, and they knew my parents favorably, I think, in spite of Dad's work with the CIO. Our entire family was active in the Lithia Springs Methodist Church and was well respected in our community. Still, these men were quite localized in their outlook. There had never been a conscientious objector in Douglas County, and they were not about to recognize one. A young Jehovah's Witness had met with the board just before me. One board member was very angry as I went in because the young man had said he would refuse to salute the American flag. Now, I had talked briefly with the young man before his meeting and was concerned for him because he had not had the many advantages of education and family support that I had had. I was, however, proud to salute the Stars and Stripes, even though both he and I placed God above country. A couple of the draft board members were a bit belligerent toward me during my meeting. They wanted to know what I would do if a rapist attacked my sister. I told them that I would certainly try to physically restrain the rapist, although I didn't know for sure how I would react in such a confrontation, but I also noted that I didn't equate such a one-to-one situation with two nations at war where many civilians would be among the casualties. My position went something like this. I believe in a supreme being, a God of love, and that every human person inherits that love in some form. Therefore, in good conscience, I cannot kill because it would be like killing a part of God. I take the 10 Commandments to heart, including thou shalt not kill. Some say that I am an idealist and not very practical. I hope that I am. I believe that Jesus was an idealist. What can be more practical in human relations than the way of Jesus? To do good to them who hate you and love your enemies. Other ways lead to the ravages of war. Take up the sword and perish by the sword. Though I am a Christian, a follower of Jesus, yes, nonviolence is the best way, even though it meant that Jesus accepted crucifixion. Greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for another. As soon as I left the building, the local board classified me as 1A and mailed me a notice that I was available for military duty. I immediately appealed to the state board. Years later, I was able to get a copy of the minutes of action by the local board and appeal board. I'm unclear as to just when I had a hearing before the state judge. Did I make another trip from Connecticut to Georgia in the spring of 1952, or was the hearing called for in the summer after I left Hartford? I do recall that the hearing was before a single judge and that he was much more sympathetic than the local board, listened closely, and seemed tolerant of my views. My parents went with me to meet him in Atlanta. I guess that maybe Reverend Leon Sanborn also went with me. Continuing with the draft board minutes, on May the 6th, the appeal board reviewed my file and voted 3-0 and classified me 1A. On June the 6th, they forwarded to the appeal board by the state director for resubmission an erroneous classification. The appeal board again reviewed and voted 4-0 to submit the file to the department for recommendation. The cover sheet on June the 10th was forwarded to the Department of Justice for advisory recommendation. When my semester at Hartford Seminary was over, I went to New York and Philadelphia looking for an assignment overseas. I visited Point 4, additional appropriate agencies, and the offices of Emma Williams, head of the Foreign Missions for the Methodist Church. I had been in correspondence with Mr. Williams regarding an assignment in Africa, but my problems with Uncle Sam and the wax found in my ears during the mission board's medical exam put a hold on any possible assignment. They also wanted me to have some experience before going overseas. I then learned about a position with the Presbyterian Board of Home Missions at Warren Wilson Junior College near Asheville, North Carolina. I applied for the job as dairy manager and agriculture instructor at Warren Wilson and got the job, starting immediately as a volunteer and then officially on July 1st, 1952. Cows have to be milked every day. I wrote to the draft board in June to tell them of my new position and address, and I took up my new duties. I heard nothing more from the draft board until the following spring. But the local board was not happy with this 10-month delay. March 11, 1953, the Georgia State Headquarters of the Selective Service System, presumably in response to an inquiry from the local board, wrote to them. They said that, quote, "The United States Department of Justice has advised this headquarters that the investigation reports on the above-listed registrant were submitted to the hearing officer on August 1952. As yet, they have not received the recommendation of the hearing officer, and the appeal is still pending." End quote. In other words, the FBI investigation had reached the hearing officer, but he was sitting on the report. In the meantime, I was thoroughly busy at Warren Wilson. Then Mother sent me a clipping from the front page of the Atlanta Constitution, April 3rd, 1953. Draft board resigns in Douglas County. Lack of cooperation is charged. Resigned after charging lack of cooperation by Selective Service Headquarters and the Federal Justice Department in handling the case of Douglas County registrant, failure to take action concerning John Martin Ramsay, neither Ramsay nor his father, John G. Ramsay, a Southern CIO organizer and public relations representative, could be reached for comment. Spruill said the members explained their resignations as follows. In respect to the boys already serving on and some who have already died, we cannot, with a clear conscience, call anyone else with John Martin Ramsay's case in the present status. On April 7, 1953, Mr. Spruill wrote to the classification officer and received this reply. Mr. Ramsay's hearing was held on January 30, 1953, but due to the press of other matters, it has been simply impossible for me to prepare and file my formal report. The report has been dictated and in due course should be received. Under my recommendation, Mr. Ramsay would be deferred as a conscientious objector within the meaning of Section 6J of the Universal Military Training and Service Act. Then the minutes of the local board continued on April the 7th. File returned to headquarters from the Department of Justice with recommendation that registrant be placed in 1O. T. Oscar Smith, Special Assistant to the Attorney General of the Department of Justice, sent a letter to the Appeal Board which concerned me. Until then, I assumed that the FBI was perfection itself. But the letter stated, registrant was born in Philadelphia. Well, I was born in Bethlehem. It stated, while in Ohio, he attended the Methodist Church. No, it was a Presbyterian church. The Fellowship of Reconciliation, a pacifist youth movement. No, it's not a youth movement, but the letter concluded, after consideration of the entire file and record, the Department of Justice finds the registrant's objections are sustained as both to combat and non-combatant training and service. It is therefore recommended to your board that the registrant be classified in Class 1O. At least the Department of Justice recognized the validity of my objections. Continuing with the draft board minutes, in May, on the 7th, adjudicated by a field board classed 1A. On the 8th, forwarded to LB. I think that's the secretary. On the 11th, received the file, appeal board, in her handwriting, and classified 1A by appeal board on May 7th. 2 yes and 1 no. Mailed the SS Form 110, notice of classification, mailed letter advising registrant he may appeal to the President. All correspondence concerning registrant received in the office while the file was on appeal and added to the file. In the end, after some unrecorded negotiating, the split vote 2-1 gave me the right for a presidential appeal. A unanimous vote gave no option for the presidential appeal. It seems the state board preferred to pass the case on again, and I immediately appealed to the Presidential Appeal Board and tried once again to express my beliefs. I noted that, quote, I have an inner compulsion, a living drive to make the way of love the powerful force it was meant to be. On the world scale, it means working together for better economic conditions, for better trade relations, for understanding and reconciling our various ways of life, end quote. Warren Wilson College President Arthur M. Bannerman wrote to the draft board on May 20th, quoting from a formal statement provided to the draft board a year earlier, on June 11, 1952, Mr. Ramsay is a truly appointed missionary for full-time mission service and is, for the purposes of the Draft Act, a minister of our church. Art didn't want to lose his dairy manager and agriculture instructor. Somebody had to milk the cows. Reverend Irving Deal, Elizabeth Landfield, and Ethel Clem, 3 of the faculty colleagues of mine at Warren Wilson, also wrote to the draft board. Mother and Dad appeared at the draft board in Douglasville to examine my file. They found nothing but material to support my position as a conscientious objector. My file was then forwarded to the district attorney. On August 3, 1953, the National Selective Service Appeal Board voted 3-0 to classify me 1A. I had exhausted the possible appeals and had to face induction or break the law. I knew what I would do by this time, but I wasn't going to go to jail without objection. I composed a letter and sent it to 151 people who could attest to my sincerity. I was still under the illusion that if Selective Service could be convinced of my sincerity, they would classify me as a conscientious objector. Perhaps it is just as well that I went on milking cows each day and carrying on my duties as a teacher and college community member, because I didn't have the financial resources nor the interest to tackle an imperfect judicial system. I continued to live as honorably as possible day by day. I wrote to the draft board, "Should I be called for induction, I must refuse to take the oath of induction and thus would break the law. I am sorry that in a free land this is necessary, but it's better to break a civil law than to break the direction that God gives me. One is a crime, the other a sin. Being at Warren Wilson has proved to be constructive work in line with what God has planned for me. Therefore, I will stay at Warren Wilson until forcibly removed. No, I won't put up a fight, but I won't go willingly for what I feel is God's work." President Bannerman wrote, "We would be put in a hard position here at Warren Wilson if we were to lose Mr. Ramsay just at the beginning of the fall term. As you know, good teachers are generally hard to get, and they are particularly hard to secure in a church situation such as Warren Wilson College, where the salary scale is lower than in public institutions." My letter to my friends expressed my disappointment, if not my despair. I asked them at least to speak up for other conscientious objectors, if not for me. 64 of them wrote to my draft board. The first 2 were from my parents. My father's was addressed to President Eisenhower. "Dear President Eisenhower," dated September 1st, 1953. "Perhaps I am late in writing you in regards to my son John M. Ramsay, who appealed to the County Draft Board, the State of Georgia Appeal Board, and to the Presidential Appeal Board for a 1-0 classification as a conscientious objector to war. These appeals have not changed the 1A classification given by our county board. I have always allowed my children the freedom to individually seek and do the will of God. I have always been ready to help them out in my personal experience. In this matter, I have had no experience and had not allowed my personal conjecture to influence this decision. Perhaps my personal convictions can best be explained from a page in the Armed Forces Prayer Book, which gives a prayer that I had written at the request of Dr. Daniel A. Poling, and a portion of my comment to Dr. Poling as follows. John Ramsay, Public Relations Director of the CIO, writes, "I have not had a personal experience in war. In World War I, I was too young. In World War II, I was too old, and my sons were too young. At the present time, I have 2 sons who will probably soon be in service. May God richly bless you. Our Heavenly Father, in these troubled times, when men are distrustful and fearful of each other, grant that our faith in Jesus Christ can overcome the bitterness of heart and mind. Grant that we can recognize corporate sin, but love the individual. Grant that all men may love Thee enough that wars may cease. May I not only be willing to die for my nation, but determined to live for Jesus Christ and His kingdom. Grant me Thy peace, O Lord. Amen." Continuing the letter that Dad wrote, he says, "My son John applied for draft deferment to complete his education. He had to appeal to the state board for this privilege. Upon his graduation, he received immediately a draft status of 1A. He asked for a reconsideration, and at the request of the county draft board, made an 800-mile trip to meet them. The board members did not appear at the meeting. Later on that day, he saw the chairman of the board, who told him that he would call another meeting. John waited over the weekend, and as he was leaving again for college, he received a notice that the board had met without his presence and still gave him a 1A classification. He then appealed to the state board. The State Appeal Board referred John's case to the Department of Justice, who had the FBI investigate into his past history. I believe a thorough investigation was made by the FBI and the Department of Justice. It was recommended that he was a sincere, conscientious objector and should be given the classification. The county draft board then resigned, making a public statement which was printed in the Sunday edition of the Atlanta Constitution, which also stated that John's father was Director of Community Relations for the CIO. Of course, my employment has nothing to do with John's request for a 1-0 classification, but it was used to confuse prejudiced minds. The State Appeal Board then voted against his request 2-1, and an appeal was made to your board. We were told that no direct appeal could be made, that your board would make its decision upon the facts as they appeared in John's file. John authorized his mother and I, in his absence, to look at the file. We did, and found no facts to prejudice his appeal, except the statement of the local draft board that he did not make up his mind immediately on first registration. John offered to serve as an agricultural missionary or instructor in Korea or anywhere else that could use his talents to build a better world as a Christian and as an American. He made applications with the MSA of our federal government, the Methodist and Presbyterian churches. All advised him to gain 3 years of practical experience at home before going to the foreign field. John has continued his studies at Hartford's Connecticut Missionary College. During this period, he prepared for foreign service in phonetics, health, etc. The Presbyterian Church then accepted him as herdsman and instructor in agriculture at Warren Wilson, our Presbyterian Missionary College in Swannanoa, North Carolina. This position was later classified as one for alternative service. My son-in-law, Earl A. Todd, was in the service in World War II. My son, William, is now in service with a classification 1AO. He graduated from Fort Sam Houston as top man in his class as an X-ray technician. My youngest son, Dick, is now a senior at Berea College. He is just 19, and when he reached this age, he requested a 1-0 classification instead of student classification. He was also turned down. The new county draft board did not feel competent and passed the buck, so to speak. Mr. President, I sincerely believe this case was settled by various steps on the basis of prejudice and not on fact. I believe in the laws of our land and abide by them. If I do not agree, I will work to change them. In the case of my son, John M. Ramsay, I believe the decision that has been made is wrong, and I urge your personal attention. Respectfully yours, John G. Ramsay. Mother's letter discloses her more partisan stance. Dear sirs, I am writing as the mother of my son, John Ramsay, who has appealed to you for the classification of 1-0 or conscious objector to war or serving in the military, but who is quite willing to serve his country in alternative service, which the law provides for those who feel so strongly to their conscience under God. I understand you, the local board, has the right to reopen the case, which now has gone through the procedure of appeal to the state and president. I urge you to reopen his case, and on the record of your own files, you must be convinced that John is sincere. We have brought him up from youth with the desire to discover the will of God and live by it. I am proud that he has taken this stand. Certainly, unless we change our attitude toward other nations and other people on this earth, we have nothing to look forward to but more war. We will be forced to live like rats under the ground, as a commentator has said regarding the Russian hydrogen bomb, unless we learn to live above the ground like children of God. The treatment John has received certainly gives cause to lose faith in those who have the responsibility to carry out our laws, which say that they uphold each individual's right to freedom of conscience in this matter. Mr. Spruill, the original chairman of the first draft board, has even since moved from Douglasville and is taking no more responsibility for his actions. Yet his lack of understanding in John's case will leave an imprint on John's life. You have responsibility to reconsider the evidence which you have before you in this case and grant him his right to his conscience on this matter under our law. You have young men's lives in your hands, and more than that, you have a deep responsibility for their souls. Yours sincerely, Mrs. John G. Ramsay. Of the letters from men and one woman who had served in the country in a fight for freedom of conscience, here is one to represent the many others. Dear sirs, I have just learned of the situation in which John M. Ramsay finds with respect to the stand your board has taken concerning his induction into the armed forces. I am told that the board does not accept as sincere his statement that he is a conscientious objector. I have known John Ramsay and worked with him in student Christian activities in the Southwest region. I know that whatever statement he would make to your board would be made in truth and with utter sincerity. I have known John's family and therefore know his background and what he has been taught as he has grown up. And I know that all teaching and background to which he has been exposed would lead him to take a position as conscientious objection to war. I write to you because I believe an injustice has been done to this young man. I would like to point out that I myself do not agree with his position. I served as an officer in the regular army during World War II and after, and resigned in the grade of major. I had nearly 3 years of uninterrupted frontline service, and I am proud of what has been referred to as a brilliant military career. I say this only to point out that I, at one time, considered it necessary to take up arms in defense of my country, and I have never regretted that decision, nor have I changed my attitude toward military service. But I do firmly believe in the right of any person to decline to serve if he sincerely believes that God's law forbids it. Our government has seen fit to legally recognize this position. I believe that we are all duty-bound to see to it that a fight for freedom throughout the world, every legal protection must be given to freedom of conscience, or we place ourselves in a false position. I am sure members of your board cannot disagree with me in this, and that when you are convinced of the sincerity of any young man, he will be given the opportunity for alternative service which the law provides. I attest to the sincerity of John Ramsay. Respectfully yours, John C. Gleason. And a part of another such letter. I have known John for 13 years and detected the seeds of his present convictions long before he became of draft age. This, in addition to the fact that John was reared in a very devout Christian family, which has consistently attempted to see the relevance of Christianity to day-to-day living. This family has been of great inspiration to me personally. I am able to write these words in spite of the fact that I do not agree with the decision John has reached. In 1941, I reached the opposite decision. I chose to join the Army. I conceived it my duty in order to save our God-given rights to disagree with one another in good conscience. Since I am unreservedly convinced that John Ramsay is sincere in his religious convictions against his participation in war, a refusal to classify him as a conscientious objector would seem to indicate that my own vision of fighting to preserve the democratic way was, in this case, pursued in vain. It would sadden me to have to come to this conclusion. Sincerely yours, Reverend Norris B. Woody, Director of Campus Life at Alderson Broadus College in Philippi, West Virginia. My favorite letter is from my cousin Grace Price. She speaks for me. Dear sirs, having heard that my cousin John Ramsay has received another 1A classification from his draft board, and conscious that he has appealed the case as conscientious objector to the full limits as prescribed by law, I feel that perhaps as a close relative and childhood companion, I can be of aid in convincing you that he is very sincere in his convictions. Idealistically, if all men believed as John Ramsay does, there would be no such thing as war. Even our Bible tells us that good conquers evil. John Ramsay is as good a Christian and is doing as Jesus would in refusing to take up weapons against his fellow man. If only all of us followed the teachings of our Bible as sincerely, the world would not be in the state of chaos that it is in now. This belief of John Ramsay is not something that has popped up overnight. Even in childhood, he was the peacemaker, the one to refrain from taking sides in quarrels. I do hope that you have given this letter full consideration and will not reject John Ramsay's appeal as a conscientious objector. I implore you to follow your conscience. He is. Very sincerely yours, Grace A. Price. There are two letters which are quite different from all the others, but are worth repeating because they give voice to general sentiments of Americans at the time. Gentlemen, a resident citizen of Berea, Kentucky has contacted me with reference to a letter received from the above party appealing for assistance with your board in an attempt to avoid being drafted for service by reason of religious belief, conscientious objection to war. This citizen is one of many who have received letters from this party requesting their aid, and this citizen requested that I inform you that she has no sympathy whatsoever with the demand of the above party, and that it is her feeling that he should be obligated to enter the service immediately, that he is not sincere in his belief. This citizen has a son in service, and several other individuals from this community who have received these letters have sons or relatives who have patriotically served their country, and it is not their desire to be used as a lever in an attempt to avoid serving in the armed forces. For your information, I am closing a copy of the letter he sent. Very truly yours, Guy K. Durson, Jr., Commander of the American Legion Post Number 50. The second letter. Dear Sir, the conscientious objector, Mr. John M. Ramsay, Swannanoa, North Carolina, has written us requesting we plead his case. Why should we plead for him not to be drafted when we have 3 sons and 1 son-in-law in the service? If my boys have got to go into service, it is no more than right some others ought to go. He wants us to talk with our friends, write to our local paper and congressmen that our voices might be heard. If all boys and girls refused to serve, we would soon be run over with the enemy, and then these conscientious objectors would be the first one to say, shoot the hell out of the leaders and lawmakers. We all could be conscientious objectors if we were afraid to die and didn't care for anyone but ourselves. I don't wish anyone hard luck, but I do hope he has to serve for even a short while. His brother, he didn't mention his name, is a conscientious objector too. Here's hoping that you will do right by them all. I remain, Mrs. J. M. Sutherland, Fletcher, North Carolina. P.S. He wouldn't approve of this if he could read it, but I'm sure I am right. Now, in a letter that she mailed directly to me, Mrs. Sutherland asks, how would you propose to stay free if you don't have war and conquer your enemies? You asking Alice to help you when her husband is in the Navy and her 3 brothers in the Army? What kind of Christian are you? Just a yellow-bellied coward. You and your conscientious objections. What would you do if the enemy came over here and killed your sisters and raped your mother and did all the things that war does to women and children? I have begun to think that you haven't got a heart. Well, I appreciate Mrs. Sutherland had courage to speak her mind and to write to me directly. Note that neither she nor the previous letter knew me personally. Those who knew me best were like Morris, my roommate and best friend in college, who served in the front lines in Korea. He said, above all, his stand has not been for lack of courage or patriotism, for it would have been much easier for John to go into the Army and even into war. Charles Morris Wesley. In spite of the flood of favorable letters, I was ordered for induction. I made arrangements at Warren Wilson for managing the dairy and my classes and took the bus to Atlanta. Early on 15th of October, I was at Douglas County Draft Board. I felt it was great irony that the board, which seemed to deny my sincerity, singled me out with the following appointment. Special confidence being placed in the integrity and ability of John Martin Ramsay, he is hereby appointed leader of a contingent of selected men from the local board number 49, state of Georgia. He is therefore charged with the enforcement of the selective service regulations governing selected men en route to the joint examining and induction station during the journey from Douglasville, Georgia to Atlanta, Georgia. And all the men included in this contingent are directed to obey his lawful orders during the journey. Well, we arrived at the induction center in Chamblee without incident. I immediately informed the processing officers of my intention to refuse induction. We were given a physical exam and supper and shown to our bunks. I was informed that I would be given a psychiatric evaluation after supper. As I recall, it was about 10 o'clock before I was called in by the psychiatrist. The examination lasted maybe an hour, and the psychiatrist ended up by commenting that I would not be an asset to the Army, and that he would recommend 4F. That was a surprise to me, and I left him and went to bed almost on cloud 9. Imagine, after 5 years of worry, to be free of any further obligation, no more hearings, no more wondering about the future, no required alternative service, free to live my life as I saw fit. I fell into a peaceful sleep. At 4 a.m. I woke suddenly with the understanding, to me it came from above, that the 4F suggestion could be a lie calculated to break me, and that I should not get my hopes up. After breakfast, I requested to speak with the induction officer to learn the results of my psychiatric evaluation. The clinical record states, quote, patient has protective marginal social history. Patient is passive, markedly effeminate, although denies homosex experience, presents paranoid feelings as well as self-primitive tendencies, immature personality. End of quote. But those were simply nasty words to add to my file because I was recommended in spite of them as suitable Army material. After lunch, 11 of us were assembled and lined up for the induction ceremony. I had learned that the step forward when your name was called before the oath of induction was given was the critical point. If you stepped forward, you were no longer a civilian and under civil law, but were then already under military law. That I could not allow to happen. But what if someone nudged me when my name was called? What if I twitched? What if I fainted? Well, when my name was called, I didn't move and was quietly ushered out of the room to wait in the major's office until the ceremony was over. I was then read my rights, arrested, fingerprinted, and asked to file a statement. It is in my file, witnessed by 3 officers, and it states, I am a conscientious objector to war and cannot conscientiously participate in any military organization. This fact is based on my convictions about God as expressed by Jesus. To accept induction would be to forsake my conscience and to deny that the law provides for sincere religious objectors. End quote. I was then sent to see a judge who allowed me to go home on my own recognizance. I would have to await trial. I then hired Morris B. Abram, an attorney, to represent me. His fee was $500 as a retainer, with an additional fee to depend on the outcome of the case and how much time was involved in my defense. I was able to return to Warren Wilson and resume my duties there, as well as my courtship, for the remainder of the fall, winter, and spring terms. The rest of the draft story can be dealt with in short. Attorney Abram pursued legal technicalities in the case. There are often technical issues which can be argued regardless of the moral issues involved. Mine had something to do with my not having been provided with a report from the FBI. A Supreme Court decision in another case meant that my case was dismissed in the summer of 1955. That was good news, but there was also bad news. My file was then returned to the local draft board in Douglasville, Georgia, and the entire process was repeated with a 1A classification from the draft board, a split vote from the state appeal board, and a final presidential appeal. During this time, my parents had moved to Washington, D.C., and Dad had become a deacon in the National Presbyterian Church. Among the members of the church were President Eisenhower and J. Edgar Hoover. Dad spoke to Reverend Elson, the pastor, about my situation. On May 3, 1956, I was informed that I had finally been granted a 1O classification. It was the day my first son, Martin, was born. I also learned that since I was 26 years old and a father, I would not be called up for military service in any account. Although relieved, I also felt that our system of government had failed. I wanted it to work. It was like sour grapes that my conscientious objection to war was only recognized by pulling strings. It took me many years to heal emotionally from the entire experience. I felt out of sync with society. I was forced to feel special while I only wanted to be treated fairly. I had been denied service overseas. I was threatened with jail, fingerprinted. The stigma hung on until 1991, but that's another chapter in my memoirs. I remain deeply committed to giving my life in a service which will make peace, not war. Although I no longer am certain that love is stronger than hate, I know that I will try my utmost to wage peace, beginning at home and then encompassing the whole world. I believe in the golden rule that we should treat others just like we want them to treat us. Gracie was right. I want to be a peacemaker. For some reason, I have not been called on to forfeit my life in the process of making peace. Instead, I have given my life to opportunities that God has presented as a teacher, an educator, a dairyman, and as a dancing master who was aware that when people from many different persuasions and even from different countries dance together, they are less likely to shoot each other. So start the music and dance on.